The crack of a rifle shot echoed across the fields, sending a flock of startled crows into the cloudless Montana sky, as Grace Sullivan lowered the smoking gun and wiped the sweat from her brow. She'd missed the coyote that had been circling her wheat fields again, and her hands trembled with exhaustion as she propped the rifle against the weathered fence post. It was the summer of 1878, and the unforgiving sun of Broken Ridge, Montana, beat down on acres of golden wheat that whispered with the gentle breeze wheat that would rot in the fields if she couldn't bring it in soon. Grace stared at her sun-bronzed hands, once soft and delicate, now calloused and rough from months of working the land alone. Her late father's homestead had been her sanctuary and burden since his passing 3 months ago, leaving her with 160 acres of promise and hardship. At 24, she'd learned to handle most farm chores, but the harvest was different. It required strength she simply didn't possess and help she couldn't afford. She trudged back toward the modest 2-story farmhouse, her boots kicking up dust along the well-worn path. The property had been her father's dream, a fresh start after her mother's death 6 years prior. They'd traveled west from Pennsylvania with hope in their hearts, and her father had worked himself to death making this land produce. Now it was hers, along with the debts and responsibilities that came with it. Inside the kitchen, Grace splashed cool water on her face from the basin and caught her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall. Her auburn hair was escaping its practical braid, and her green eyes looked weary beyond her years. The wheat had been ready for days now, and with each passing hour, she risked losing everything. A knock at the door startled her. Grace wasn't expecting visitors, especially not out here, 5 miles from town. She dried her hands on her apron and opened the door cautiously. Mrs. Abigail Porter, the postmaster's wife, stood on her porch with a sympathetic smile and a basket of fresh bread. "Thought you could use a little something, dear," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Town's been talking. Harvest time's upon us and everyone's wondering how you're managing." Grace accepted the basket with a grateful nod. "I'm managing just fine, Mrs. Porter." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. The older woman's eyes scanned Grace's face. "No, you're not, and there's no shame in that. A woman alone can't bring in a wheat harvest, not without breaking her back or losing half of it to the elements." She patted Grace's hand. "Have you thought about selling? The Hendersons would give you a fair price." Grace bristled. "This was my father's land. I won't give it up." "Then you need help, child," Mrs. Porter sighed. "I hear that cattle drive coming through might have some hands to spare." "The trail boss is stopping in town today for supplies." "I can't afford to hire men," Grace admitted, the words painful to speak aloud, "then offer a share of the crop." Mrs. Porter headed back to the door. "Pride won't fill your storeroom for winter, Grace Sullivan. Remember that." After Mrs. Porter left, Grace paced the kitchen floor. The idea of asking strangers for help grated against everything her father had taught her about self-reliance. But as she looked out the window at the golden fields swaying in the breeze, she knew she had no choice. She changed into her second-best dress, a faded blue cotton with fewer patches than her work clothes, and hitched her mare to the wagon. The ride to town took nearly an hour, and by the time she arrived in Broken Ridge, the afternoon was well advanced. Broken Ridge wasn't much a main street with a general store, saloon, small hotel, church, blacksmith, and a smattering of other businesses. Horses were hitched outside the general store, and Grace could hear the boisterous laughter of men who'd been too long on the trail. She smoothed her skirts and tucked loose strands of hair behind her ears before entering Whitaker's general store. The conversation inside died as the bell above the door announced her arrival. 6 men turned to look at her 5 rough-looking cowboys and an imposing figure who could only be their leader. He stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a straight posture that commanded attention. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, and despite the trail dust on his clothes, he carried himself with quiet dignity. When he tipped his hat to her, revealing dark blonde hair and striking blue eyes, Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Madam," he greeted with a voice as smooth as aged whiskey. "Miss Sullivan," Mr. Whittaker called out from behind the counter. "What brings you to town today?" Grace swallowed hard, suddenly aware of every eye in the room on her. I'm looking to speak with the trail boss passing through." The words nearly caught in her throat. The tall man stepped forward. "That would be me, Forrest Xavier, at your service." He extended a hand, and when Grace placed her fingers in his grip was firm but gentle. "How can I help you, Miss Sullivan?" Grace withdrew her hand quickly, unnerved by the warmth that spread up her arm at his touch. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Xavier. Might we speak privately?" Curiosity flickered in his eyes, and he nodded. "Of course. Boys, finish up here and meet me at the saloon when you're done." He gestured toward the door. "Shall we step outside, Miss Sullivan?" Outside on the boardwalk, Grace explained her situation in direct terms, refusing to color her words with desperation even as her heart raced with anxiety. "I have 100 acres of wheat ready for harvest, but I can't manage it alone. I can offer 20% of the crop in exchange for help bringing it in." Forrest Xavier studied her for a long moment. 100 acres is a lot for one person," he observed. "Where are your menfolk?" "My father passed this spring, there's just me now." Grace lifted her chin. "I've managed everything else but the harvest." "It's a 2-week detour at least," he said, more to himself than to her. "We're driving 2,000 head to Wyoming and the boss won't like the delay." "I understand," Grace said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Xavier." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "I didn't say no, Miss Sullivan." Hope flared in her chest as she turned back to face him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I might be able to help, but I need to see the land first." "How far is your place?" 5 miles north. "I have my wagon." Forrest nodded. "Let me speak with my men. We can ride out and take a look before making any decisions." An hour later, Grace sat beside Forrest on the wagon seat, acutely aware of his presence as 5 of his cowboys followed on horseback. The silence between them felt charged with unspoken questions. "How long have you been on the trail, Mr. Xavier?" she asked, desperate to fill the quiet. 6 weeks from Texas," he replied. "And please call me Forrest. Mr. Xavier makes me feel like my father." "Then you must call me Grace," she offered, surprising herself with the informality. "Grace," he repeated, and something about the way her name sounded in his deep voice made her grip the reins tighter. "How long have you been working this land alone?" 3 months since father died, but I've been helping him since we arrived 6 years ago." Forrest nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's hard country for a woman alone." "It's hard for anyone," Grace replied with a touch of defensiveness. "But it's good land and it's mine." A small smile tugged at his lips. "I can see why you won't give it up." They crested a small rise and Grace's farm came into view. The wheat fields stretched out golden and ready, the farmhouse and barn sitting proudly against the backdrop of distant mountains. "There it is," Grace said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. Forrest's expression was unreadable as he surveyed the property. When they reached the farmhouse, he jumped down from the wagon and offered her his hand. Grace hesitated only briefly before accepting his help, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach when his strong fingers wrapped around hers. For the next hour, Forrest and his men walked the fields, examined the wheat, and assessed the work ahead. Grace followed, answering questions about the land and watching anxiously as they conferred among themselves. Finally, Forrest approached her, his hat in his hands. "It's good wheat, Grace. Should yield well if we can get it in soon." "And will you help me?" she asked, hating how vulnerable the question made her feel. Forrest looked back at his men, who were watering their horses at the trough. "I can spare 4 men and myself for 10 days. We'll take 15% of the crop as payment." Relief flooded through Grace. 20% was my offer. 15 is fair," he insisted. "We'll start tomorrow at first light." "You have a deal, Mr. Xavier Forrest." Grace extended her hand, and he took it, his calloused palm warm against hers. There's a bunkhouse behind the barn where your men can stay. It's not much, but it'll be a palace compared to sleeping on the ground with 2,000 head of cattle for company," he assured her with a smile that reached his eyes. That evening, Grace prepared the largest meal she'd cooked since her father's funeral beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved venison. As the cowboys washed up outside, she set the kitchen table with mismatched plates and her mother's good silverware. When they filed in for dinner, hats in hands and hair slicked back with water, Grace was struck by how they transformed the quiet house with their presence. Forrest introduced his men: Hank, the oldest at 40 with graying temples; Miguel, whose quick smile revealed a gold tooth; Jesse, barely 20 and eager to please; and Caleb, quiet and watchful with clever hands. During the meal, Grace learned that Forrest had been running cattle drives for 8 years, that he'd fought briefly in the war as a very young man, and that he had a reputation for getting herds to market with minimal losses. The men clearly respected him, deferring to his judgment and responding to his subtle cues. "This is mighty fine cooking, Miss Grace," Jesse enthused through a mouthful of cornbread. "Thank you," Grace replied, unused to compliments after months of solitude. "It's nice to cook for someone besides myself." Forrest's eyes met hers across the table. "How have you been managing all this time?" Grace busied herself with refilling water glasses. "One day at a time, Mr. Xavier, just like everyone else." Later, after the men had retired to the bunkhouse with full stomachs and promises of an early start, Forrest lingered on the porch. Grace found him there, staring at the star-filled sky, his profile strong against the darkness. "Thank you," she said quietly, joining him by the railing. "For helping me." Forrest turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You're a brave woman, Grace Sullivan." "Not brave," she corrected him. "Just stubborn, according to my father. Stubborn serves you well out here." He smiled, and in the silver moonlight, Grace noticed how it softened his features. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Grace nodded and retreated inside, but sleep was elusive that night. The house felt different, knowing there were people nearby, knowing he was nearby. She told herself it was simply relief that her crop would be saved, nothing more. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was Forrest Xavier's blue eyes and gentle smile that followed her into her dreams. Dawn broke with the promise of another scorching day. Grace was up before first light, preparing coffee and a simple breakfast of biscuits and bacon. By the time the men arrived from the bunkhouse, she had the table set and food waiting. "You don't need to feed us like this every meal," Forrest said as he accepted a cup of coffee. "We're used to trail rations." "Nonsense," Grace replied. "If you're helping me bring in my harvest, the least I can do is make sure you're well fed." She didn't add that cooking gave her purpose, made her feel less useless as the men tackled the work she couldn't do alone. They set out for the fields as soon as the sun crested the horizon. Grace had her father's harvesting equipment ready: scythes, cradles, pitchforks, and the old wagon with fresh straw in the bed. She'd spent her savings on new grain sacks stacked in the barn. Forrest divided the men into teams, and Grace watched in amazement as they fell into a rhythm, cutting the wheat with practiced efficiency. She worked alongside them, gathering and binding sheaves, ignoring the ache in her back and the sweat trickling between her shoulder blades. By midday, the sun was merciless. Grace brought water out to the fields, moving from man to man with a dipper and words of encouragement. When she reached Forrest, he paused, leaning on his scythe. "You push yourself too hard," he observed, watching as she struggled with a bundle of wheat nearly as big as herself. "I can manage," she insisted, though her arms trembled with the effort. Forrest took the bundle from her, his fingers brushing hers. "There's no shame in knowing your limits, Grace." "I can't afford limits," she replied, more sharply than intended. "Not if I want to keep this farm." His eyes softened with understanding. "We all have limits. The trick is knowing when to push them and when to accept help." Grace looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "I'm not good at accepting help," I noticed. There was a smile in his voice that made her look up again. "But you're learning." The day progressed in a blur of activity. By sunset, they had harvested nearly 10 acres more than Grace could have managed in a week on her own. As they walked back to the house, muscles aching and clothes stiff with sweat and chaff, Grace felt the first stirrings of real hope. With these men, her crop would be saved. Days fell into a pattern. Up before dawn, breakfast by lamplight, then out to the fields until dusk. Grace worked alongside the men as much as possible, though Forrest often diverted her to tasks better suited to her strength, cooking meals, bringing water, sharpening tools, and keeping records of their progress. On the third night, a summer storm blew in from the mountains. Grace watched anxiously from the porch as lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the plains. "Will the rain damage the wheat?" Forrest asked, joining her outside despite the first heavy drops that began to fall. "Not if it dries quickly," Grace replied. "But if it's followed by heat and humidity?" "Rot," Forrest finished for her. Grace nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as a chill wind picked up. "We should check on the sheaves we've already cut." "Not tonight," Forrest said firmly. "It's too dangerous in a lightning storm." "But first thing tomorrow," he promised. "The boys and I will spread them out to dry if needed." Grace reluctantly agreed, but as they turned to go inside, a particularly violent gust of wind tore at the barn doors. "The doors!" she cried, running down the porch steps into the rain. Forrest was right behind her, his longer strides quickly overtaking her as they raced toward the barn. The heavy wooden doors were banging violently, threatening to tear from their hinges. Together they fought to secure them, rain soaking through their clothes in seconds. The crossbar. Grace shouted over the howling wind, pointing to the heavy beam that had fallen. Forrest hefted it into place while Grace held the doors steady, their bodies pressed close by necessity. When the doors were finally secure, they stood for a moment in the relative shelter of the barn's overhang, catching their breath. Grace became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the rain dripping from Forrest's hair onto his face, of how his wet shirt clung to the muscles of his chest and shoulders. His eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them that had nothing to do with the lightning overhead. "We should get back inside," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. Forrest nodded, but neither of them moved immediately. When a crash of thunder broke the moment, he placed a gentle hand at the small of her back and guided her toward the house, a gesture both protective and proper. Inside, Grace quickly excused herself to change into dry clothes, her heart racing from more than just the dash through the rain. When she returned to the kitchen, Forrest had also changed, his hair still damp but combed back from his forehead. "Tea," she offered, busying herself with the kettle to avoid meeting his eyes. "Thank you," he said, settling into a chair at the table. "This is quite a storm." "They blow up quickly here," Grace replied, placing cups on the table. "My first year in Montana, I was caught in a hailstorm that nearly took off the roof." The conversation turned to weather and farming, safe topics that helped ease the tension between them. As the evening wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Grace found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of her mother's death from influenza, and of her father's decision to seek a new life in the West. "He was a good man, my father," she said softly. "Stubborn as the day is long, but fair and honest. He taught me everything I know about this land." "He'd be proud of you," Forrest said, his voice warm with sincerity. "Not many women would take on a homestead alone. Not many would have a choice," Grace countered. "I couldn't bear to lose his dream after watching him work himself to death for it." Forrest studied her face in the lamplight. "What's your dream, Grace?" The question caught her off guard. I don't know anymore. Survival, I suppose." "That's not a dream, that's a necessity." He leaned forward slightly. "What do you want for yourself, beyond just surviving?" Grace looked down at her hands, at the calluses and small scars that marked her years of hard work. "I want this land to flourish. I want to see the orchard my father planted bear fruit. I want." She hesitated, then admitted the truth she'd barely acknowledged to herself. "I want not to be alone." The words hung in the air between them. Forrest's expression was unreadable in the flickering light, but his eyes never left her face. "Loneliness is its own kind of hunger," he said finally. "One that's harder to satisfy than an empty stomach." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. "I should let you rest," Forrest said, rising from his chair. "Tomorrow will be busy, especially after this rain." "Yes, of course," Grace agreed, standing as well. "Thank you for the company." At the door, Forrest paused. "Good night, Grace Sullivan," he said softly, and then he was gone into the storm, leaving Grace with a curious ache in her chest that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Morning revealed the storm's damage several downed trees near the creek. A section of fence toppled, and worst of all, nearly an acre of cut wheat blown from its neat stacks and scattered across the field. The men set to work immediately, salvaging what they could and repairing the fence while Grace tended to a leak in the barn roof. By midday, the sun had emerged, drying the sodden fields enough for harvesting to resume. Grace worked alongside Caleb, gathering wheat into bundles while keeping one eye on Forrest, who was working with Miguel at the far end of the field. "You watch the boss mighty close," Caleb observed quietly, startling Grace from her thoughts. "I'm just checking on everyone's progress," she stammered, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Caleb's smile was knowing but kind. "He watches you too when you're not looking." Grace's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to focus on her work. "Mr. Xavier is simply being considerate of his client." "If you say so, Miss Sullivan." Caleb tipped his hat and moved on to the next row, leaving Grace to her thoughts. Did Forrest really watch her when she wasn't looking? And why did the possibility make her pulse quicken? She reminded herself sternly that in a few days the harvest would be complete, and Forrest Xavier would drive his cattle on to Wyoming, leaving her behind. Developing feelings for him would be foolish and painful. Yet as the days passed, Grace found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet trail boss. She noticed how he always took the heaviest loads himself, how he made sure his men rested in the shade during the hottest part of the day, how he listened attentively when she spoke of farming techniques or local weather patterns. On the 6th day, disaster struck. Jesse, the youngest cowboy, slipped while loading sheaves onto the wagon and fell awkwardly, twisting his ankle badly. Grace heard his cry of pain and hurried over to find Forrest already examining the injury. "It's not broken," Forrest pronounced after gentle probing, "but you won't be walking on it for a few days." Jesse's face fell. "I'm sorry, boss, I didn't mean to slow us down." "Accidents happen," Forrest assured him. "Grace, do you have anything we can use as a bandage?" Grace nodded. "I'll get my medical supplies from the house." With Jesse propped between Forrest and Hank, they made their way back to the farmhouse, where Grace cleaned and wrapped the swollen ankle. "You'll need to keep it elevated," she instructed, placing a pillow under Jesse's foot. "And stay off it entirely for at least 2 days." "But the harvest," Jesse began to protest. "Will continue without you," Forrest cut in firmly. "You're no good to us if you make that injury worse." With Jesse confined to the house, the work slowed considerably. Grace took on more of the physical labor, ignoring Forrest's concerned looks as she pushed herself harder to compensate for the missing pair of hands. By sunset, her muscles were screaming in protest, and a persistent ache had settled between her shoulder blades. As she struggled to lift a particularly heavy bundle, Forrest appeared beside her. "Enough," he said quietly, taking the bundle from her hands. "You're going to hurt yourself." "We're behind schedule," Grace argued, though she couldn't hide her wince as she straightened. "And working yourself to exhaustion won't help." His voice was gentle but firm. "You need rest too, Grace." She wanted to argue, to insist she could keep going, but her body betrayed her as her knees suddenly wobbled. Forrest's arm shot out, steadying her with a firm grip on her elbow. "See," he said, his face close enough that she could see flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "Even the strongest have limits." Grace nodded reluctantly, allowing him to escort her back to the house. Inside, she found Jesse reading one of her father's old books, his injured foot propped on a kitchen chair. "Miss Grace," he exclaimed, attempting to stand before Forrest gestured for him to remain seated. "You look plumb worn out, madam." "I'm fine," she insisted, though she sank gratefully into a chair. "Just a long day." Forrest filled a basin with water and placed it on the table in front of her. "For your hands," he explained when she looked up in question. "The blisters will be worse tomorrow if you don't tend them tonight." Grace stared at her hands, dirt-encrusted, with angry red spots where new blisters were forming atop barely healed ones. Wordlessly, she placed them in the cool water, sighing as the sting gradually eased. "I'll see to dinner," Forrest said, already rolling up his sleeves. "Jesse, tell me where everything is." Grace started to protest, but the relief of sitting down was too great. She watched in amazement as Forrest moved around her kitchen with surprising competence, slicing bacon, mixing cornmeal for johnnycakes, and setting coffee to boil. "Where did you learn to cook?" she asked as he expertly flipped a johnnycake in the skillet. 8 years on the trail teaches a man a few things," he replied with a small smile. "Can't always count on having a chuck wagon cook who knows what he's doing." By the time the other men came in from the fields, Forrest had a simple but hearty meal prepared. Grace found herself watching him throughout dinner, noting the easy way he interacted with his men, the quiet authority he commanded without raising his voice, and the genuine concern he showed for Jesse's comfort. After the meal, when the other cowboys had returned to the bunkhouse and Jesse was dozing in the chair by the fire, Forrest joined Grace on the porch. The evening was cool, a welcome respite from the day's heat, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Thank you," Grace said after a comfortable silence, "for dinner and for understanding." "You don't need to thank me for seeing what's plain as day," Forrest replied. "You work harder than any woman or man I've known." "Not hard enough to bring in this harvest alone," she admitted, the words less painful now than they had been a week ago. "No one could," Forrest said simply. "That's why people build communities out here, to help each other through the impossible tasks." Grace considered his words. "I've been so focused on proving I could manage alone, I forgot that my father never did. He always traded labor with neighbors during harvest time." "Why did you think you had to do it all yourself?" Forrest asked, genuinely curious. Grace sighed, watching a shooting star trace across the sky before answering. "After Father died, Mr. Henderson offered to buy the farm. When I refused, he said I'd come begging to sell before harvest time, that no woman could run a farm this size." Her hands clenched in her lap. "I was determined to prove him wrong." "And you have," Forrest pointed out. "Asking for help doesn't mean you failed. It means you're smart enough to recognize when a task requires more than one person." His words eased something tight in Grace's chest. "You're a wise man, Forrest Xavier." "Not wise," he said with a quiet laugh. "Just older than I look and stubborn enough to have learned a few lessons the hard way." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the chorus of night insects and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Grace was acutely aware of Forrest beside her, of the scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to him, of how easy it felt to sit with him like this. "Tell me about your life before cattle drives," she said finally. "Where did you come from?" Forrest was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was measured, as if carefully choosing his words. "I was born in Virginia. My father owned a small farm, nothing like this. When the war came, I was just 16, but I enlisted anyway. Saw things no boy should see." He paused, looking out at the darkness. "When I came home, everything was different. I was different, couldn't settle back into that life." "So you came west," Grace prompted gently. Forrest nodded, "drifted for a while. Worked ranches in Texas, tried mining in Colorado, found I had a knack for handling cattle and men." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Turns out those two aren't so different sometimes." "And now," Grace asked, her voice softer than she intended, "what are you looking for now?" Forrest turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. For a long time, I wasn't looking for anything except the next job, the next trail, but lately. He hesitated, then continued with careful honesty. Lately I've been thinking it might be time to stop drifting. Something in his tone made Grace's heart beat faster. What would that look like? Stopping? Land of my own, maybe. A place to build something that lasts longer than a season. His eyes held hers. Someone to share it with. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Grace was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of how easy it would be to lean just slightly and feel his shoulder against hers. The moment was broken by Jesse calling from inside. Needing help to move to the makeshift bed they'd prepared for him in the front room. Forrest stood quickly and the spell was broken. "Good night, Grace," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Try to get some rest." "Good night," she replied, remaining on the porch long after he'd gone inside, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling through her. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Despite Jesse's injury, they made good progress on the harvest, helped by favorable weather and long hours. Grace found herself watching Forrest more often, catching his eyes on her when she least expected it, and wondering about the possibilities his words had stirred. On the 9th day, with nearly 80 acres harvested and only a few days' work remaining, a dust cloud on the horizon announced riders approaching. Grace shaded her eyes against the sun and felt her stomach clench when she recognized Thomas Henderson's large frame leading 2 other men toward her property. Forrest noticed her expression and moved to stand beside her. "Trouble? Possibly," Grace replied, squaring her shoulders. "That's Thomas Henderson, the man who wants to buy my farm." Forrest's face hardened slightly. "Want me to send him on his way?" The offer was tempting, but Grace shook her head. "No, I'll handle him, but I wouldn't mind if you stayed nearby." They waited as the 3 riders approached, and Grace noticed how Forrest positioned himself slightly behind her right shoulder, close enough to support, but allowing her to face Henderson directly. "Afternoon, Grace," Henderson called as he reined in his horse. His gaze shifted to Forrest, sizing him up with obvious disapproval. "I see you found help after all." "Mr. Henderson," Grace acknowledged coolly. "Yes, Mr. Xavier and his men have been kind enough to assist with my harvest." Henderson dismounted, his heavy boots raising dust as he approached. He was a large man in his 40s, prosperous and used to getting his way. "And what's it costing you? More than the crop is worth, I'd wager." "My arrangements with Miss Sullivan are not your concern," Forrest said before Grace could respond, his voice pleasant but with a steel edge that made Henderson's eyes narrow. "I don't believe I was addressing you, Cowboy," Henderson said dismissively. "Grace, be reasonable. Once these hired hands move on, you'll be right back where you started alone with more work than you can manage." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I've managed for months, Mr. Henderson, and I'll continue to do so. My crop is being harvested, my debts will be paid, and my farm is not for sale." Henderson's face darkened. "You're making a mistake. Winter's coming and you won't last." "I believe the lady has made her position clear," Forrest interrupted, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Grace. "Perhaps you should respect her decision and be on your way." For a tense moment, Henderson seemed ready to argue further, but something in Forrest's steady gaze made him reconsider. He jammed his hat back on his head and remounted his horse. "You know where to find me when you change your mind," he said to Grace, then jerked his chin at his companions and rode off in a cloud of dust. Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. "He can be persistent." Forrest's expression was troubled as he watched the retreating riders. "Has he threatened you?" "Not in so many words," Grace admitted, "but he makes it clear he expects me to fail." "And when you don't?" Forrest asked, turning to face her. Grace managed a small smile. "Then I suppose he'll have to find another farm to covet." Forrest didn't seem entirely satisfied with her answer, but he nodded and returned to work. Throughout the afternoon, Grace caught him watching the horizon, as if expecting Henderson to return. That evening, after dinner was cleared away and the men had retired to the bunkhouse, Forrest lingered in the kitchen, helping Grace dry the last of the dishes. "Henderson wasn't wrong about everything," he said carefully, hanging a tin cup on its hook. "Winter will be difficult alone." Grace folded a dish towel with precise movements. "I'm aware of the challenges, Forrest. I've lived through Montana winters before. With your father," he pointed out gently. "There's a difference between facing a blizzard with family and facing it alone. What would you have me do?" Grace asked, a hint of frustration coloring her voice. "Sell to Henderson, give up everything my father worked for." "No," Forrest said firmly, "never that, but there are other options besides selling or struggling alone." Grace stilled, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Such as?" Forrest moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Partners. Someone to share the work, the worry, the rewards too." Her heart began to race. "Partners," she repeated, the words somehow inadequate for what seemed to be hanging in the air between them. "Grace," Forrest said, his voice lower now, "in these past days I've come to admire you more than any woman I've known. Your strength, your determination, your kindness." She turned to face him, hardly daring to breathe. "Forrest, let me finish," he requested gently. "I know we've known each other only a short time. I know this might seem sudden, but sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of going slow." He took a deep breath. "I'm 40 years old, Grace. I've spent half my life drifting, never putting down roots, but being here with you. It feels right in a way nothing else has." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to leave when this harvest is done," Forrest admitted, his blue eyes intent on hers. "I'm saying I think we could build something good here together. If you'll give us a chance." Grace searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity and finding none. "This is unexpected." A smile touched his lips. "For me too. I didn't come here looking for anything but a temporary job." "And found?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Something I didn't know I was missing." His hand reached for hers, hesitant, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't, and when his calloused fingers closed around hers, it felt like coming home after a long journey. "I don't know what to say," Grace admitted. "This is all happening so fast." "You don't need to say anything yet," Forrest assured her. "The harvest won't be done for another few days. Take that time to think, to decide if this is something you might want to." Grace nodded, grateful for his understanding, even as part of her already knew what her answer would be. "And your cattle drive, your employer?" "I'll make arrangements," Forrest said simply. "Hank can take the herd the rest of the way. He's been ready to step up for a while now." They stood in silence for a moment, hands still joined, the possibility of a future together suspended between them like a delicate thread neither wanted to break. "It's late," Grace said finally. "We should both rest." Forrest nodded and reluctantly released her hand. At the door he paused. "Good night, Grace Sullivan, dream well." "Good night," she replied, and after he left she pressed her fingers to her lips, wondering at the emotions coursing through her and the decision that lay ahead. The next morning brought a clear sky and a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the harvest. Grace found herself watching Forrest as he directed his men, noting the quiet competence in his movements, the respect he commanded without demanding it, the way his smile transformed his face when he caught her looking. Jesse, his ankle much improved, was able to help with lighter duties, and the work progressed steadily. By sunset, they had only 20 acres left to harvest, perhaps 2 more days of work with good weather. As Grace prepared dinner that evening, she found herself humming, a lightness in her step that had been absent for months. The possibility Forrest had offered partnership, companionship, perhaps something deeper filled her with a cautious hope she'd almost forgotten she could feel. After dinner, when the kitchen was clean and the men had returned to the bunkhouse, Grace took a lantern and walked to her father's grave on the small rise behind the orchard. She knelt beside the wooden marker, brushing away a few leaves that had settled there. "I wish you could have met him, Father," she said softly to the night air. "Forrest Xavier, he's a good man, strong and kind and honest, the kind of man you would have respected." She traced the letters of her father's name carved into the marker by her own hand. "He wants to stay. To build a life here with me." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the young apple trees her father had planted with such hope. Grace could almost imagine it was his voice, giving his blessing. "I'm going to say yes," she decided, speaking the words aloud, making them more real. "I think it's what you would want for me, not to be alone, to have someone to share this dream with." She stayed a while longer, watching the stars emerge overhead, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. When she finally rose to return to the house, she found Forrest waiting at the edge of the orchard, a respectful distance from the grave. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said softly. "I saw you walking with the lantern and wanted to make sure you were safe." "You're not intruding," Grace assured him, moving to his side. "I was just talking to my father." Forrest nodded in understanding. "And what did he have to say?" Grace looked up at him, moonlight silvering his features. "He would have liked you, I think." Something in her tone must have conveyed her decision, for Forrest's expression shifted, hope brightening his eyes. "Grace, does that mean yes?" she said simply. "I want you to stay, Forrest. I want to see what we might build together." For a moment, he seemed frozen, as if afraid to believe what he was hearing. Then his face broke into a smile more brilliant than any she'd yet seen from him. "May I kiss you, Grace Sullivan?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Grace stepped closer and lifted her face to his. Forrest's hand came up to cradle her cheek, his touch gentle as if she were something precious and fragile. When his lips met hers, the contact was soft at first, questioning. But as Grace leaned into him, her hands coming to rest against his chest, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of promise and passion and possibility. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Forrest rested his forehead against hers. "I think I've been waiting my whole life to find you," he confessed. Grace smiled, her heart too full for words. Instead, she took his hand and led him back toward the house, toward the beginning of their life together. The final days of the harvest passed in a golden haze of hard work and shared glances. Forrest spoke with his men, explaining his decision to stay. To Grace's surprise, they received the news with knowing smiles rather than shock. "About time the boss found himself a home," Hank commented, clapping Forrest on the shoulder. "And a mighty fine woman to share it with." On the afternoon of the 11th day, they cut the last of the wheat. As Grace tied the final sheaf, a cheer went up from the men. The harvest was in her farm was saved. That evening they celebrated with a feast. Grace used precious stores to make a special meal: fried chicken, fresh bread, the last of her preserved peaches. They ate at the long table in the yard, under a canopy of stars, with lanterns casting a warm glow over their faces. After dinner, Miguel produced a battered guitar from his saddlebags, and soon the air was filled with music. The Cowboys sang trail songs and ballads, their voices blending in the night air. When Miguel struck up a waltz, Forrest stood and extended his hand to Grace. "May I have this dance, Miss Sullivan?" With a smile, Grace placed her hand in his, and he led her into a simple waltz in the yard. As they moved together, the rest of the world seemed to fade away until there was only Forrest, his strong arms around her, his blue eyes reflecting the stars above. "I've been thinking," Forrest said as they swayed to the music. "We should marry before winter, make everything proper." Grace's heart skipped a beat. "Are you asking me to marry you, Forrest Xavier?" His smile was tender. "I suppose I am, though not as formally as you deserve. I don't have a ring yet, but—" "I don't need a ring," Grace interrupted. "Just your promise." "That you have," Forrest said solemnly. "My promise to stand beside you, to share your burdens and your joys, to build a life with you on this land, if you'll be my wife." "Yes," Grace whispered, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling in her chest. "I will be your wife, Forrest Xavier." His arms tightened around her, and as their lips met in a kiss that sealed their promise, The cowboys erupted in cheers and whistles, making Grace laugh against Forrest's mouth. 2 days later, the cattle drive continued on to Wyoming with Hank in charge. Jesse elected to stay behind with Forrest, declaring that he'd had about enough of cows for a while and would prefer to learn farming. The other men promised to return for the wedding, which Grace and Forrest had set for October, after the wheat was sold and before the winter snows. As they watched the dust cloud of the departing cattle fade into the distance, Forrest's arm around Grace's waist, she felt a profound sense of rightness. Where once she had feared the future, now she looked forward to it with hope and anticipation. "What are you thinking?" Forrest asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That I'm no longer too weak to finish the harvest," Grace replied with a smile. "That together we can face whatever comes." Forrest's laugh was warm against her hair. "You were never weak, Grace Sullivan, just human like the rest of us." His arms tightened around her. "And now we're stronger together than either of us could be alone." As summer faded into autumn, Grace and Forrest settled into a rhythm of work and planning. They took the wheat to market in Great Falls, returning with supplies for winter, and a simple gold band that Forrest placed on Grace's finger in a private moment by the creek where they had first acknowledged their feelings. The wedding was held on the first Saturday in October, with Reverend Phillips from Broken Ridge officiating. The ceremony took place in the yard where they had danced on the night of the completed harvest, now decorated with autumn wildflowers and ribbons. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Porter's skilled hands, and carried a bouquet of late-blooming flowers from her garden. Hank, Miguel, and Caleb returned as promised, bringing news of a successful delivery of the cattle and Forrest's final pay. Jesse stood proudly as Forrest's best man, his limp barely noticeable now. Townsfolk who had once kept their distance, certain that Grace would fail alone, came bearing gifts and well wishes, impressed by her determination and pleased by her happiness. Even Thomas Henderson attended, somewhat grudgingly, but with a respectful nod to the couple that acknowledged he had underestimated Grace's resilience. As Grace spoke her vows, looking into Forrest's steady blue eyes, she thought of how much had changed in just a few months. From desperation and loneliness to partnership and love, from uncertainty to promise. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, and Forrest's lips met hers in a tender kiss, she knew that the harvest had yielded far more than wheat. It had yielded a future. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting and laughter that echoed across the fields where they had worked so hard together. As the guests began to depart, Hank pulled Forrest aside for a private word, then approached Grace with a smile. "Mrs. Xavier," he said, the new name making Grace's heart skip, "I've got a wedding present for you both." He reached into his pocket and produced a folded paper. "Deed to a small herd of cattle, 20 head good breeding stock waiting for you at the Johnston place in town. Figured you might want to diversify a bit." Grace's eyes widened. "Hank, that's too generous." The older cowboy shook his head. "It's from all of us who rode with Forrest these years. He's been more than a boss, he's been family, and now so are you." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes as she embraced the weathered cowboy. "Thank you, all of you." Later that night, when the last guest had gone and they were finally alone in the farmhouse that was now truly their home, Forrest drew Grace into his arms. "Happy, Mrs. Xavier?" he asked, his voice tender in the lamplight. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. "And you? I found everything I didn't know I was looking for," Forrest replied, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "A home, a purpose." His eyes held hers with unwavering devotion. "And you, Grace, the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." As autumn deepened into winter, Grace and Forrest faced the challenges of the season together. They prepared the farm for the cold months, built up the small herd of cattle Hank had gifted them, and made plans for spring planting. Jesse proved himself invaluable, quick to learn and eager to help, becoming like the younger brother neither of them had ever had. The first heavy snow came in late November, blanketing the farm in pristine white. As Grace stood by the window watching the flakes swirl in the bitter wind, she thought of how differently she felt compared to last year's first snowfall, when dread had been her primary emotion. Now, with Forrest's strong presence in the house and their future unfolding before them, winter held no terror. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Grace resting against Forrest's chest with his arms around her, she shared news she had been saving for the right moment. "I visited Dr. Matthews in town yesterday," she said, her voice soft but steady. Forrest's arms tightened slightly around her. "Are you unwell?" Grace turned in his embrace to face him, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "Not unwell," she said, watching his expression. "Just expecting." Comprehension dawned in Forrest's eyes, followed by wonder and then joy so profound it transformed his features. "A baby, you're certain?" Grace nodded, her own happiness reflected in his face. "Dr. Matthews says late spring, probably May." Forrest's hand remained on her stomach as if he could already feel the tiny life growing within her. "A child," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Our child. Are you pleased?" Grace asked, though his reaction left little doubt. In answer, Forrest gathered her closer, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "Please doesn't begin to describe it," he said when they parted. Grateful, amazed, terrified in the best possible way, Grace laughed, joy bubbling up within her. "Those are my feelings exactly." Forrest's expression grew serious. "I promise you, Grace Xavier, our child will want for nothing I can provide. Love, security, guidance, all the things every child deserves." "I know," Grace said simply, trusting completely in the man she had married. "That's why I'm not afraid, even though bringing a child into this world is no small thing." They sat together by the fire long into the night, making plans, sharing dreams, reveling in the knowledge that their family was already growing. Spring came to Montana with its usual capriciousness, warm days followed by sudden freezes, brilliant sunshine giving way to drenching rains. The farm awoke from its winter slumber, and Grace, now visibly carrying their child, supervised the planting from the shade of the porch while Forrest, Jesse, and two local boys they'd hired worked the fields. Her father's orchard bloomed for the first time that April, the delicate white and pink blossoms a testament to his vision and patience. Grace often found Forrest there in the evenings, inspecting the tiny forming fruits with the same care he showed the cattle and the wheat fields. "We'll have apples by fall," he said one evening as Grace joined him among the trees, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "Your father would be proud." "He would be prouder still of what we're building here," Grace replied, leaning against her husband's sturdy frame. "Not just crops and cattle, but a home, a family." Forrest's hand covered hers where it rested on her stomach, feeling the strong kicks of their active child. "I thank God every day that I took that detour to help with your harvest," he said softly. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Grace corrected with a smile. "Asking me to marry you was your best decision." Forrest's laugh was warm as he bent to kiss her. "You're right, as usual, Mrs. Xavier." In early May, as the last of the spring flowers bloomed and the fields showed the first green promise of the wheat to come, Grace gave birth to a son. He arrived after a long labor, squalling his protest at leaving the safety of his mother's womb, with a shock of dark hair and eyes as blue as his father's. "Samuel Thomas Xavier," Grace whispered, cradling the tiny bundle in her arms while Forrest sat beside her on the bed, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration. "After my father and yours." Forrest traced a gentle finger along his son's perfect cheek. "He's beautiful, Grace, perfect." "He has your eyes," Grace observed, though she knew the blue might change as he grew. "And your determination," Forrest replied with a smile. "Did you hear those lungs?" As spring turned to summer, baby Samuel thrived, growing stronger each day under the devoted care of his parents. Jesse appointed himself honorary uncle, crafting a wooden cradle and spending hours entertaining the infant with songs and stories. The farm prospered as well. The wheat grew tall and healthy, promising an abundant harvest. The cattle multiplied with 5 new calves born that season. Forrest even added a small herd of sheep, diversifying their livestock and ensuring they would have wool as well as meat and dairy. When harvest time came again, they were prepared. Forrest hired additional hands, and Grace, with Samuel strapped to her back in a carrier Forrest had fashioned, helped where she could. There was no desperate race against time this year, no fear of losing everything. Instead, there was the steady rhythm of shared work and the satisfaction of watching the storerooms fill with the fruits of their labor. On the anniversary of the day Forrest had arrived at her farm, Grace prepared a special dinner. While Samuel slept peacefully in his cradle, she and Forrest ate by candlelight, reminiscing about those first days together. "You looked so fierce," Forrest recalled with a smile. "Standing in Whitaker's store, chin up, asking for help but refusing to beg for it." "And you looked like salvation," Grace admitted. "Though I was too proud to show how relieved I was when you agreed to come." Forrest reached across the table to take her hand. "I knew within days that I didn't want to leave you." By the end of that first week, I was trying to figure out how to ask if I could stay. "I'm glad you found the courage," Grace said softly. "I can't imagine my life without you now." "You'd have managed," Forrest said with confidence. "You're the strongest person I know, Grace Xavier." Grace shook her head. "Strong, perhaps, but incomplete. You and Samuel, you're the pieces that make me whole." After dinner, they walked out to the porch, where the harvest moon hung low and golden over their fields. Samuel stirred in his cradle inside, and Grace went to fetch him, returning to settle on the porch swing with the baby in her arms. Forrest joined them, his arm around Grace's shoulders, his free hand gently stroking his son's dark hair. "Look at what we've built," he said, his voice filled with quiet wonder as he gazed out at their land. "A year ago you were afraid you'd lose everything. Now we have everything," Grace finished for him. "The land, the harvest, each other, and this little miracle." Samuel yawned, his tiny fist waving in the air before settling against his mother's chest. Grace looked down at her son, then up at her husband, her heart full to bursting with gratitude and love. "From weakness to strength," she murmured. "From solitude to family, from fear to hope." Forrest's arm tightened around her. "And this is just the beginning, my love, just the beginning." As the stars emerged overhead, painting the vast Montana sky with silver light, Grace Xavier knew with absolute certainty that the harvest they had brought in together, the harvest of love and trust and shared dreams, would sustain them through all the seasons yet to come.